Today, motion picture is the most prestigious art form. It is what painting was for Da Vinci, and it's what theater was for Shakespeare. That is to say, it's the art form with the most resources, the highest ambition, and most importantly, the biggest cultural impact. Especially here in the United States, entire decades of culture are defined by the movies and the shows that came out that decade. But I'm not just talking about pop culture. Motion picture has changed how democracies work. It's changed how we consume information, and my favorite, it's changed how we can teach and how we can learn. My favorite docuseries is Cosmos: A Space-Time Odyssey. But a lot of people don't know that Cosmos is actually a sequel to the 1980s Cosmos: A Personal Voyage, hosted by Carl Sagan. And then in 2013, the torch was passed to his protege, Neil deGrasse Tyson. I was in my first year of film school when Tyson's Cosmos came out, and I had this unnerving feeling that even if I succeeded and graduated and got a job somewhere in LA where I could work my way up the ladder to some point where I had any creative authority, maybe by 2030, by then I don't think cinema will be the top dog anymore. Certainly it'll be replaced by something computer generated, something interactive that isn't a video game, but certainly isn't a movie either. Something we don't have a word for yet. Consider the following. If you look at Cosmos 1 and compare it to Cosmos 2, you can see that there's obviously a substantial increase in our ability to generate visual graphics. But if we were to extrapolate and assume that a Cosmos 3 is going to come out in 2040, the graphical leap will not be as substantial between 2 and 3 as the leap between 1 and 2. And the reason is that you cannot get more realistic than reality itself. You hit a wall. And by 2040, our pre-rendered graphics will be at that wall. They will be indistinguishable from reality itself. But what do I mean, pre-rendered graphics? What's the difference between pre-rendered graphics and real-time graphics? Well, it's basically the difference between the visuals you see in movies and the visuals you see in video games. Let's compare the first Toy Story, which came out in 1995, to Super Mario 64, which came out just a year later. Toy Story is running at 24 frames per second. Mario is running at 30 frames per second. But there are a lot fewer pixels per frame in Mario than there are in Toy Story. But more importantly, Toy Story has a finite number of frames, 114,240 frames of animation to be exact. And each of those frames could take as long as they need to render. Some frames of Toy Story took as many as 30 hours just for that one frame. Mario 64, on the other hand, needs to be able to run indefinitely. And every frame needs to be rendered on the spot. And since it's running at 30 frames per second, that means each frame is rendered in a 30th of a second. And there are some parts of the game that are too hard for the Nintendo 64 to handle, and your frame rate will actually go lower. This is a real problem for speedrunners. Now obviously pre-rendered graphics are always going to look better than real-time graphics. Already we can watch cutscenes and not be able to tell whether or not what you're looking at is real. To be clear, this isn't. What you're looking at here is a pre-rendered cutscene from a video game, and that video game came out 5 years ago. But let's compare pre-rendered graphics from 1995 to real-time graphics of 2019. I'm using Kingdom Hearts 3 here because it actually has a Toy Story section, and we can compare apples to apples that way. Obviously, the animation in Kingdom Hearts is ass. But the model quality and the texture resolution is easily on par with Pixar's 25 years ago. But look at this one from Logan. Here you have young Hugh Jackman coming down the stairs and walking around old Hugh Jackman. Now it's actually pretty easy to clone yourself in video. You just shoot the one, then you shoot the other, and you just kind of splice them together. But that is not the technique they're using in this scene. Here, old Hugh Jackman is actually Hugh Jackman, but young Hugh Jackman is Hugh Jackman's stunt double, and they've just replaced his head with a CG head. Let me repeat that. Young Hugh Jackman's head here isn't real. This head was completely made in a computer. That is insane! Just like we can compare Kingdom Hearts 3 to Toy Story 1, we will also be able to compare video games of the next 50 years to pre-rendered visual effects like this. Someday, video game graphics are going to be as good as Hugh Jackman's head here. But what is a video game really? What makes something a game versus not a game? You'll find thousands of pages of discussion on the internet about this question. For example, the Stanley Parable. A lot of hardcore gamers say this isn't a game because you can't run, you can't shoot, you can't even jump. There is no win state. In fact, you can't even lose in the Stanley Parable. Is it a game if you can't lose?
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
The Stanley Parable is obviously an interactive experience. You'll get something from it when you play it. This whole conversation does nothing but really limit the art that we can create. But as we proceed into this next generation of interactive art, this question is going to become even more prominent, and I propose that we develop a spectrum of interactivity. On the leftmost, we'll have what I call dynamic observation. My best example is this old film called 12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men mostly takes place in a single room with a jury arguing over a case. It's actually a really good movie. But since most of this movie takes place in a single room, we could actually remodel and reanimate this entire movie and allow users to watch using room scale VR that already exists right now. So I would be able to watch all these events unfold from this corner of the room, but my friend might decide that he wants to watch it from that corner of the room, so technically what we're experiencing is slightly different, even though the events we're observing are exactly the same. What if you could watch an episode of The Office in VR, and you could actually see the characters walking around and interacting with each other? They wouldn't interact with you though, they wouldn't even be aware that you're there. It would be a choreographed performance, not that much different from what we have in cinema already. And imagine a version of Cosmos where you actually get to stand in the ship of the imagination and a model of Neil deGrasse Tyson stands next to you and you can see, first of all, how short you are compared to him, and he'll make eye contact with you when he's talking. But let's say you don't like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Why wouldn't you be able to swap him out for Carl Sagan, or even Albert Einstein, or Robert Faraday, or Nikola Tesla? But as we proceed down the spectrum of interactivity, we'll get to a point where characters do interact with you. We have technology now that allows us to talk to Siri, talk to Alexa, and they can understand us and respond. Someday these types of technologies are going to find their way into video games. For a long time, we've had the ability to choose pre-selected dialogue options, and the characters will respond with pre-selected responses. But soon, we'll be able to actually talk with our own words to characters, and they'll generate responses not unlike Siri and Alexa. What kind of amazing game mechanics could you use this for? I like the idea of a breakfast club in VR, where you and the 5 characters are there and you actually get to talk to them and build relationships with them.
Don't mess with the bull, young man. You'll get the horns.
What about a VR version of Friends where you can actually sit in the coffee shop and talk to the characters? If you ask Ross one thing, he'll respond differently than if you ask Rachel that same question. And if you follow this to its natural conclusion, you'll have what I call persistent AI relationships. Let's say one day you drop into a virtual version of Cheers, you have conversations with all these people in the bar, and then you go home. But not only are they programmed to respond specifically to you, they are actually going to remember things about you. And so the next day you boot back into Cheers and you go to the bar and lament about your daily problems, and these characters will ask you persistent questions. They'll remember who you were from the day before. And it really will be a place where everyone knows your name. Once you have AIs with the capability of developing persistent relationships, users are obviously going to prefer AI relationships over real relationships. If an AI were to model itself completely around you and satisfy what you need out of a partner completely, that is going to blow real relationships completely out of the water, where you have to have a 50-50 and compromise with each other.
So what's she like?
Well, her name's Samantha, and she's an operating system. She's really complex and interesting.
Wait,
And it's only been a few.
I'm sorry. You're dating your computer?
But when we talk about having relationships with computers, we come back to a quite old question actually. Can machines think? Alan Turing asked this question 70 years ago in his paper titled Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. Now, I've actually read this paper and I was surprised by just how much of it is spent arguing about the idea of consciousness. Who actually is conscious? Some argue it's just human beings, Homo sapiens. Most argue, at least these days, that the line of consciousness isn't between man and everything else, but it is between that of animals and that of plants. Plants live, but they don't have a nervous system, they don't think. But for a lot of people, it's not about consciousness, it's about the soul. So far in the year 2019, we have zero evidence of the existence of souls. Why has this idea of the soul only belonging to humans been perpetuated for so long? It makes it a hell of a lot easier to raise cows and slay them for meat if you don't think that there's any pain involved. And that's a very interesting thing to consider when we move into a world where AIs may or may not be able to feel pain. HBO's Westworld is easily one of the best science fiction works of the last decade, especially the first season, but it's science fiction of the pessimistic variety, like Black Mirror. Westworld is this exclusive theme park where those who can afford tickets are able to live out their fantasies. The park is filled with these lifelike animatronic androids called hosts, which are unable to harm humans, but which humans can do whatever they want to, consequence-free. Now, there are multiple parks with multiple themes, but as the name would suggest, the primary one is an old Western theme with cowboys and Indians. In this old Western setting, every host plays an individual character, and each individual character has individual motivations and individual backstories. Now, the guests that come in, or players as I like to refer to them, can interact with whomever, however. Most of the hosts are attached to various quest lines, and players can participate in them, or they can just go on a killing rampage. This obviously has really strong resemblance to the open world RPG video games we're familiar with today, and the show definitely capitalizes on that. But the guests in Westworld are rarely nice to the hosts. And while I'm not naive enough to suggest that this is unrealistic, it does gloss over the genuine joy that comes from helping other people, even if we know those other people are just virtual characters. Now, the idea in Westworld is that this park is real. The hosts in the park are real, and so every night the hosts need to be taken underground and repaired. Now, that whole operation is obviously unfeasible. However, experiences like Westworld will exist in a software form, with the advent of computer-brain interfaces. In the future, we'll have brain computers which interface with our nervous systems and can completely immerse us in virtual worlds. Today, we have very primitive brain-computer interfaces where the brain gives input to the computer, but we're still quite far behind the curve when it comes to computer-brain interfaces, that is, a computer writing information to your brain. Imagine being able to think a question and the answer is immediately Googled and then downloaded into your brain. But on a more advanced level, imagine a computer being able to completely hijack your entire central nervous system and simulate all of your senses. That would mean complete sensory immersion in any virtual world of your choice. When these types of simulations exist, the happenstance offerings of our dual reality will struggle to compete with the promise of fantastical utopia. The truth is, this technology I'm talking about isn't just going to replace cinema. It's going to replace call center representatives, it's going to replace therapists and counselors, and it's going to replace our emotional partners. What will replace motion picture and cinema is not just a new art form or a new technology. It is nothing short of being the very foundation for our entire future as a human species.